So let's talk about Final Fantasy XVI. And let me actually put on a little bit of music while we're doing this one. Final Fantasy XVI announced for the PlayStation 5. This was announced yesterday. We're going to be taking a look at the trailer. I'm so happy. Because like last night, I was looking at this and I almost got a little bit confused with 14. Some parts of the trailer, I was like, is it the next 14 expansion? What? I was confused. But no, it's the next Final Fantasy. It's Final Fantasy 16. It's going to be console exclusive, but it's also going to be coming to PC. We will look at the trailer here in just a couple minutes. But here's a very important detail. Final Fantasy XVI producer, that's right, just producer, Naoki Yoshida, also known as Yoshi-P. How did you enjoy the trailer? The exclusive footage comprised of both battles and cutscenes running in real time represents but a fraction of what our team has accomplished since the start of development on this, an all-new Final Fantasy game. In that span, the team size has grown from a handful of core members to a full-fledged unit that continues to polish and build upon what they have created so far, all to provide players an experience unmatched in terms of story and gameplay. Our next big information reveal is scheduled for 2021, so in the meantime, I expect everyone to have fun speculating as we have a lot in store, not only for Final Fantasy XVI, but also for Final Fantasy XIV. Needless to say, I'll be working hard on both. Final Fantasy XVI producer, Naoki Yoshida. Now, for those of you that are not aware, Naoki Yoshida is also the producer and director of Final Fantasy XIV. He was the one who, like, one of the leading figures that brought Final Fantasy XIV back from the ashes after it crashed and burned in its original release. He was the one responsible for the revival of this great game that I'm currently still addicted to. Pretty much addicted. Like I'm working on this video and I'm doing this live stream and I'm just thinking about, dude, I gotta log into 14, gotta go level up my warrior, and I got stuff to do, man. You know, we got a cool picture of I think it's Ifrit here, and then we also have from the director Hiroshi Takai, who has also been involved in Final Fantasy XIV. And he says, when Final Fantasy I was released, I was just another player, a young student with big dreams. By the time Final Fantasy V was in the works, I had earned myself a seat at the developer's table, albeit at the very end. From there, I moved online, leaving my mark on both Final Fantasy XI and XIV. And now, 16. From the establishment of an all-new development environment to learning the ins and outs of PlayStation 5, the team and I have taken on countless challenges during our journey to bring you the 16th chapter in the story of Final Fantasy franchise. And though we're pouring our hearts and souls into this project each and every day, it may still be some time before we can get it into your hands. However, I promise it will be worth the wait. Final Fantasy XVI director Hiroshi Takai. You got some artwork here. I really like that there's the Phoenix there. You guys know I'm a sucker for Phoenixes, so that's going to be a big deal for me personally. And we will see the Phoenix in the trailer pretty soon here. But first, I'd like to bring some attention to this person here. He calls himself Bring Peanut Butter. He appears to know a couple of more information about the title. And, take all of this with a grain of salt. I don't know how accurate this information is, but it appears to be at least somewhat accurate. But yeah, give this guy a follow if you want to know more about this stuff, because it appears that he's going to be talking about it quite a bit. And he says, I'm going to give an overview on the people working on Final Fantasy XVI, where they come from, their experience, and speculate on the people that might also be working on this game but have not been confirmed yet. Too long didn't read. Final Fantasy Tactics / Final Fantasy XIV fans, you should be excited. Oh, man. Final Fantasy XVI is being worked on by Creative Business Unit 3, which makes sense because they already officially confirmed that Naoki Yoshida is involved. They are known for making Final Fantasy XIV. They're also very different people from the ones who worked on Final Fantasy for the past decade. They come from a very different lineage in general. And I don't really, look up too much Final Fantasy stuff, but whenever I talk about like Final Fantasy XII in my community, I haven't played it personally, but whenever I talk about that, people always say, oh no, Final Fantasy XII is great, you got to play it, all that jazz. So yeah, that's pretty good. Then he says, this means that the game will likely not see any involvement from Nomura, Kitase, Toriyama, and others who worked on and off from Final Fantasy XIII to Final Fantasy XV, Final Fantasy XIV excluded. These people are already busy working on Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 and other projects. The figurehead of this team is Naoki Yoshida. He is known for being instrumental in turning Final Fantasy XIV from a disaster into the huge success we know now. Like I've mentioned earlier, the miracle he pulled off allowed him to be the head of his own unit, as well as belonging to the Final Fantasy Committee. Yoshida is a self-admitted fan of high fantasy, preferring it over the more futuristic Final Fantasy. Now, I really like the mix, right? The Final Fantasy mix of the medieval with the high-tech stuff. I like the mix, but I can get down with a more medieval-looking. I can get down with a more medieval-looking Final Fantasy. I can get down with that. I can gel with that. He wants to go back to a time of sword and sorcery and summons the series used to be known for. Think Final Fantasy 3, 5, 6, 9, and Tactics. There's like an article here that talks about this. I think I actually read that article. I read an article about this also on, not recent, Silicon Era. I read an article about that on Silicon Era. Yoshida's favorite game is Tactics Ogre, made by Matsuno. He's also a fan of Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy XII, also by him. Those games are known for their dark political stories and mostly focusing on a medieval setting. The reason he even joined Square was to work with him. Fans definitely happy that Vieira will be in Final Fantasy XIV. Do you have any personal connection to Vieira? Of course, I love the great game that creator Yasumi Matsuno makes. And around the time I joined the company, one of his favorite games was Tactics Ogre, and that had made such an impact on myself. I felt that one of these days I would want to work with Matsuno-san and to create a game together. And so I tried really hard to build my career in the gaming industry, but the timing didn't match at first. Matsuno-san created Final Fantasy XII. By the time I joined Square Enix, Matsuno-san had already left the company, so they were not able to work together at the time, but in Final Fantasy XIV, we were able to create the Alliance Raid, Return to Ivalice series, which, as you all know, not my favorite series because I never played Final Fantasy XII, and there's a lot of lore in that, in the in-between quests. I like the raid itself, but the in-between quests, particularly the one with the big fetch quests, screw all that, which lasted for about 2 years. So through that experience, I was able to fulfill my dream to work with Matsuno-san and the Vieira that was created by Matsuno-san's Final Fantasy XII. It was something the fans definitely desired. They highly requested the Vieira to be included into the game. These games have been highly influential for the making of the reboot of Final Fantasy XIV, as many fans of the game know. Yeah, like a lot of the Ivalice raids and all that jazz, and the Vieira and all that, sure. This lineage is being carried through Final Fantasy XVI too. The director is Hiroshi Takai. He worked on the series since Final Fantasy V and was involved in the Saga series. He also directed Last Remnant, which I liked what I've played of Last Remnant. I didn't play too much of it, but I played a decent chunk. I made like a first impressions video on it, and I liked what I played of it. It was fun. Another medieval era game that focused on politics. He was also part of the task force that saved Final Fantasy XIV. He carries with that vision and talent. Now, another very important thing here is the third known person, but not outright confirmed, is Ryota Suzuki. He is most assuredly the battle director of Final Fantasy XVI. Again, this is still speculation, but basically this is a guy who worked on Capcom for 20 years, and he was a designer on Devil May Cry 5 and Dragon's Dogma. Dragon's Dogma! This guy was involved in designing the combat for Dragon's Dogma. Okay? Okay? And also Devil May Cry 5. And I know, Devil May Cry 5, also. But it's like, for me, I'm sorry, like my heart beats for Dragon's Dogma. Dragon's Dogma! Right here. So underrated. His experience on character action games are shining in the battle sequences in the trailer. You can see air combos, special attacks, juggles, and more. While we do not know much more about the people working on it, Hiroshi Takai's presence brings credibility to the speculation that the team who worked on the Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward expansion and left shortly afterwards are working on Final Fantasy XVI. Again, not confirmed, but highly probable. And when you talk about stories in Final Fantasy XIV, which is one of the ones that always comes to mind. People always like, oh my God, this expansion was friggin' mind-blowing. It was amazing. It's Heavensward. So Shadowbringers also even better, in my opinion. Like, even before Shadowbringers, people would always said Heavensward friggin' amazing. And I love Heavensward. Like, to me, Heavensward and Shadowbringers are neck and neck. It's like Shadowbringers is just a little bit higher, but Heavensward is right up in there, dude. Heavensward made me care about elves, for crying out loud, or Elezen, whatever you want to call them. But you guys know I don't care for elves. I hate elves, and Heavensward made me care about elves, which is quite the feat indeed. The first is Kazutoyo Mahiro. He worked alongside Matsuno since Final Fantasy Tactics, who his experience of medieval era Final Fantasy games is peerless. He is known for being the lead writer of Final Fantasy XIV, turning it into the story we all love. He penned it up to Heavensward and then he left. While he was also a battle systems engineer, his new role as a writer could be extremely beneficial to Final Fantasy XVI. Heavensward is still seen as one of the highest points of Final Fantasy XIV story. Having him as a writer is knowing the story is in good hands. I think the characters are born from a story. I rarely come up with a character first and then build a story around them. It's not just about telling a story, but taking into considerations the emotions of the player. And good God, did they get that right with Final Fantasy XIV. Other names being thrown around are Mitsutoshi Gondai, assistant director of Final Fantasy XIV, Kazuya Takahashi, illustrator and concept artist, Tsubasa Masao, character designer and artist, but basically those are people behind the most well-received Final Fantasy of the last decade. Masayoshi Soken, while not confirmed, might also be involved as a composer. He's still working on Final Fantasy XIV, though, which is a huge task. But the trailer music does sound like his work, which we will see in just a couple of seconds here. I'd be pleasantly surprised if he can make it happen. Cosbos does not believe this is going to be a thing. I would love for him to be involved because I really like the transitions that Soken does in Final Fantasy XIV. Like how you just get these crazy transitions that you just don't expect. Like even just think about Shiva. Think about Shiva, right? You're doing Shiva and it's a very calm music, and then suddenly when she does the thing, pluck, you start hearing like guitars and stuff. It's so good. It's so good. Or just even like friggin' what's the name? Tower, the Twining Dungeon. Amazing. Like there's so many good friggin' tracks in this game that I'd love to see it. I'd love to see it, but I don't know. What about Yasumi Matsuno? No idea. While it looks like the kind of game Matsuno would make, there's no hint of his involvement in any way. However, his legacy is being carried by the people who worked with him for most of their career and are now working on Final Fantasy XVI. I had a chance while working on Final Fantasy XIV to meet Matsuno as a gamer, and I had always great respect for him and saw him as a godlike figure. It isn't a stretch to claim that Matsuno paved the way for the kind of story and universe Final Fantasy XVI wants to tell. Tactics over NFF Tactics was the precursor of darker, more political side Final Fantasy took afterwards. It's even reflected in Final Fantasy XIV. We saw interesting similarities too. Joshua is the child of the Archduke in Final Fantasy XVI. This is a role that is also similar to Vagrant Story's Joshua, who was also the son of a duke and played a pivotal role in the game, and they also look similar. I never played Vagrant Story, but I know that ENB loves that game, if I remember correctly. His character is also quite similar to Inquisitor Heldrich from Vagrant Story. We believe in... while I do not believe 16 is tied to Ivalice or Vagrant Story, these parallels are quite interesting in the context of the development team. Anyway, I'm excited as hell. That's all I have. Would love to talk about the story and gameplay tomorrow when I have the time. But yeah, again, I don't know how reliable all this information is, but it's definitely nice to speculate on, and particularly considering the involvement of Naoki Yoshida. A lot of the stuff that is said here makes sense, and it makes me even more excited than I was just after watching the trailer. It was friggin' awesome. But now, let's actually watch the trailer itself, shall we? I've kept you in suspense long enough, though most of you have probably already watched it, but let's go ahead and watch it anyway.
You all know the target. Shiva's dominant. And only the dominant.
How do we even know the girl will be among us?
Our kind do not question orders, we follow them.
Sergeant, let's summon their icon.
Icon?
That looks like Titan.
Our foe will not relinquish their mother crystal easily. This will be a bitter fight.
You should not be out of doors. We have discussed this. Come, Joshua.
Looks like he
Your
can use his
father will be
Phoenix powers to
expecting us.
heal.
I am Joshua's shield. I'm sworn to protect him.
What do you mean you refuse? Did you not pledge your sword to our cause?
What does it matter? It was the Dalmex who drove back the Crusaders in the Battle of the Twin Realms, was it not?
Without the blessing of the Mother Crystal, we cannot defend our realm from the spread of the Blight.
Look at the Dragoon, dude! Straight out of Heaven's Word.
Dragoons. Imperial Vipers. Do they really mean to invade us?
And this scene right here looks so goddamn brutal.
It's the Archduke's son.
Phoenix.
Joshua! Stop this!
Second life on a fire. But that's impossible.
The legacy of the crystals. Has shaped our history. For long enough. I'll kill you. If it's the last thing I do.
I am so friggin' hyped. I'm so friggin' hyped, dude. Like, just legit hyped for this game. Did they talk about the audio here? They don't, right? Of course not. Would be cool to know if it was Soken or not. Not available on other platforms at a limited time offer after PlayStation 5. Wait. So not even on PC. This is a different end plate than we had yesterday. Because yesterday it said going to be available on PlayStation 5 and PC. And now it just says not available on other platforms. So it's only going to be on PlayStation 5. Early on. Like probably for a year, like the remake. So not even PC is getting this. It is what it is, dude. That Sony money. That's Sony money, dude. So it's like I can't really overanalyze a Final Fantasy trailer too much because I'm not super knowledgeable about Final Fantasy, and in the grand scheme of things, I'm still very much a noob. Let me grab this at a higher definition though. But this scene right here looks so brutal. Like, look, there's a child. You're gonna chop this dude's head off and splat. Like when I saw it, I was like, damn, this is gonna be one hell of a dark game, dude. Look at this child. Just saw someone get cut down right in front of him as he is going to summon the power of the Phoenix.
It's the Archduke's son.
These combos look badass too. And another thing that was mentioned, which was a huge complaint in Final Fantasy 15, and I can understand, was how Yoshida said he wanted to focus back on medieval times of being able to, you know, do magic and summons and combat like that. So I think we're going to be able to control the summons in this one. I mean, we were able to control the summons also in and Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I think in this game, you're going to see much better control of the summons that we had in Final Fantasy 15.
Stop this!
It was also interesting to see them refer to the primals as icons at the start of this. I don't know how common that is in Final Fantasy games. Is that a common thing? I mean, we have Cosbos and Lazy Man here on the stream who could potentially enlighten us. How often do they refer to them as icons? Because the first time I've ever heard that was in Final Fantasy XIV. That you know. Because Cosbos and Lazy Man have played almost all the Final Fantasies, if not all the Final Fantasies out here. Cosbos says he thinks it's only 14. Kegren suspects he's heard it before. But as I was saying, like, definitely icons there, I think, is a big reference to 14. And it's also one of the reasons yesterday why I thought, like, oh my god, is this going to be like something about 14? But yeah, I'm super hyped for Final Fantasy 16. I will continue to follow as we know more about Final Fantasy 16. But yeah,
The legacy of the crystals.
it's looking hella good. And with Yoshida at the helm, well, I mean, he's at the helm with Masahiro, I'm sorry. I'm terrible with names.
Enough.
Hiroshi Takai. Hiroshi Takai in him at the helm. I think that the game is in good hands. I think it is. I think we're going to see a Final Fantasy that's going to be for the ages. But we'll see if that is the case or not.